On space will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. And welcome to today's hearing entitled, "Are We Losing the Space Race to China?" I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. After the Columbia accident, President George W. Bush sought to revitalize our nation's space program by challenging NASA to return to the moon and then chart a course to Mars. Steady advances were made toward these goals with strong congressional support for the Constellation program. NASA made solid progress towards the development of the Ares 1 and Ares 5 vehicles. The commercial cargo program was initiated and the International Space Station neared completion. All of that success came to a screeching halt when President Obama was sworn in. His fiscal year 2010 budget request slashed well over $1 billion from the exploration project and budget. He then tasked a blue ribbon commission to evaluate NASA's current plans. The panel found that the original plan was not executable, something that should have come as no surprise given the Obama administration's budget cut. President Obama canceled Constellation in its next budget request, redirected even more money to Earth science to support its radical political agenda, and then guaranteed dependence on Russia for access to space for an extended period of time, which is still ongoing. So what does this have to do with China? Well, this vacuum of leadership has led not only to extended dependence on Russia for access to space, but also facilitated the ascendance of China as a leading spacefaring nation. China has capitalized on this administration's weakness by offering partnerships with other nations on missions like a return to the moon, which the U.S. chose to walk away from. Rather than charting a bold course that inspires the international community to engage with us, the Obama administration has alienated historic allies and potential partners alike. Only because of Congress is NASA building deep space exploration capabilities. Unfortunately, the administration refuses to let NASA show any detailed plans for a journey to Mars beyond a PowerPoint chart. China, on the other hand, has demonstrated a willingness to answer calls for collaboration with open arms. This has clearly strengthened their soft power and international standing. China's near-term plans for space exploration continue their nation's philosophy of steady and measured progress, but their long-term goals are very ambitious. They have already placed astronauts in orbit 5 times, launched a space station, and placed a rover on the moon. They have announced plans for a larger space station, a first-of-a-kind mission to the far side of the moon, and potentially a manned mission to the moon in the 2030s. The administration's abdication of leadership in space exploration has significant consequences. If we do not lead, someone else will. Leadership in space means security, technological prowess, and innovation. Our future prosperity depends on our leadership in space. If we do not lead, we will not set the terms and conditions for those who follow. When the U.S. explores and embarks on adventures of discovery, we take with us our ideologies and our principles. I, for one, want to ensure that space becomes a domain of freedom and liberty, not autocracy and oppression. If we do not lead, we will weaken our partnerships. I want countries to embark with us into the cosmos rather than team with China as a last resort. The Obama administration has already told the Europeans that they are not interested in their Moon Village proposal. They've tried to walk away from their commitments to the Germans on Sophia and actually abandon ExoMars. International partners have memories. They also have options. China is building a resume of accomplishments that positions them as a viable alternative. Given their recent provocative actions in the South China Sea and the long-standing oppression of their own people, we should all be wary of perpetuating conditions that push other nations to partner with China. Furthermore, we should ensure that any U.S. cooperation with China in space is mutually beneficial, appreciates the risk of technology exploitation, and fits into a larger strategic perspective that recognizes China's provocation. Aside from recent tensions in the South China Sea, China also threatens our nation's cybersecurity. Couple that with their irresponsible anti-satellite tests, one is hard-pressed to find a reason to reward their behavior with increased cooperation. We may not be in a space race with China. We may not even be competing with China in space, but the strategic choices we make clearly impact China's space capabilities, something that we should all pay attention to, given that China's civil space activities are inseparable from their military. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony today, and I thank them for appearing. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Maryland, for an opening statement.
Good morning and welcome to our distinguished witnesses today. I want to thank Chairman Babin for calling this hearing. You know, on October 4th, 1957, 59 years ago next week, the Soviet Union stunned the world when it launched Sputnik 1 into outer space. That launch, marking the first time a man-made satellite was placed into Earth orbit, caught Americans by surprise and indeed sparked fears that the Soviet Union might also be capable of sending missiles with nuclear weapons from Russia to the United States. Not long after, Congress passed legislation establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. The agency's budding space program became important in America's efforts to demonstrate U.S. preeminence and technological prowess over the Soviet Union. To that end, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress on May 25, 1961, proposing that, quote, "This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." Following a series of interim achievements that demonstrated NASA's ability to dock and perform extravehicular activities in space, the space race ended with the successful July 20th, 1969 Apollo 11 landing of the first humans on the moon. How different would today's world be if NASA had not responded to President Kennedy's challenge? And now, almost 50 years since that historic event, some are asking if we are again in a space race, but this time with China. 2 weeks ago, China successfully placed in orbit its Tiangong-2 experimental orbiting space lab. And that accomplishment comes on the heel of China's landing a robotic rover on the moon, with plans announced to do the same on Mars. So should we be concerned that China may be closing the gap in spaceflight capabilities? Well, today's panel is well qualified to address this question. In particular, I look forward to hearing about China's pace of progress in exploring space and how our track record fares in comparison. I'd also like to know if the recent success of China's space program is due to its ability to stay on course. In addition, I'd like to get the witnesses' views on what they believe the goals and objectives of the Chinese space program are and what impacts other domestic priorities have on the conduct of their space activities. So I look forward to hearing the panel's views on whether the U.S. should seek greater cooperation with other spacefaring nations, including China, and what challenges we face if we choose to do so. And just in closing, and in reference to the chairman's statement, you know, I think that there's a lot of blame that can be passed along Pennsylvania Avenue from one end to the next for the uncertainty, for the contrary priorities and confusing priorities across Republican and Democratic presidents and members of Congress. And in my very short 8 years on this subcommittee and on this committee, I've witnessed that conflict in priorities. And I think that as Democrats and Republicans here in the House and the Senate, that we would do our nation well and our nation's space program well for the future to make sure that we set down priorities that put us all on the same page when it comes to our priorities for space exploration, engage our international partners, and then commit the resources across presidents, Republicans, and Democrats that it's going to take to get the job done. And so I look forward to hearing from our panel today about those and other priorities. And with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And I now recognize the chairman of our full committee, Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today as well. Just this month, China launched its second experimental space station, While it's just a single module and is smaller than the International Space Station, it signifies continued Chinese progress and persistence. The Soviets flew their first large modular space station, Mir, 3.5 decades after the first cosmonaut went to space. China plans to have their own slightly smaller equivalent to the Mir space station in operation by the mid-2020s. This is roughly 2 decades after China launched its first astronaut into orbit. Meanwhile, the Obama administration's cuts to exploration and disruption of exploration planning has eliminated our opportunities to return to the moon, and the administration has no real plan for landing people on Mars. China continues to make progress. We cannot resign ourselves to the remembrance of past achievements. It is time for the United States to reassert its leadership. For over 50 years, the United States has been committed to the peaceful use and exploration of outer space. Our philosophical principles of freedom, the rule of law, and transparency are evident in the actions we take. The United States shares scientific data and findings, promotes international cooperation, and maintains international peace and security in outer space. The world has benefited from U.S. space leadership. The success of China's space program will be different. China does not hold the same values of our society. Unlike the United States, China does not have distinct military and civilian space programs. The Chinese military is functionally in charge of all space activities, with the Chinese National Space Agency responsible for international affairs and intergovernmental agreements. China already has demonstrated a strong disregard for interests of other countries in outer space through its anti-satellite test. Here on Earth, illegal incursions into the South China Sea represent a blatant disregard for the international rule of law. Will their disregard of international law continue to extend into outer space? When China launched its first person into space in 2003, it caught the world's attention. Over the years, our focus has waned, and now China's accomplishments in space have become commonplace. We cannot ignore Chinese achievements and become complacent. Just yesterday, the New York Times featured a large article on the largest single-dish radio telescope, which is now being built in China. China is making steady progress in all fields of exploration, including astronomy. If the United States fails to reassert its leadership, China's rise may undermine U.S. plans to transfer low Earth orbit habitation and human spaceflight from a governmental activity to a sustainable economic activity undertaken by the private sector. China stands to fill another void left by this administration's disinterest in maintaining leadership in exploration. By abandoning plans to return to the moon, the administration invited the rise of China as a leader in space. By reallocating funding from exploration to Earth science, the administration has put our leadership in space exploration at risk. Our allies stand ready to partner in an ambitious exploration program. Unfortunately, the current administration won't allow NASA to propose one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Okay, now we'll move on to, I don't see our ranking member here, so I want to introduce our witnesses at this time. The first one is the Honorable Dennis C. Shea. Our first witness today, he's chairman of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He was reappointed by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell for a term expiring December 31st of 2016. And Mr. Shea's government service began in 1988 when he joined the office of Senate Republican Leader Bob Dole as counsel and subsequently becoming the Senator's Deputy Chief of Staff in the office of the Senate Majority Leader. He's an attorney with more than 25 years of experience in government and public policy and the founder of Shea Public Strategies, LLC, a public affairs firm based in Alexandria, Virginia. Mr. Shea received his J.D. and an M.A. in history and a B.A. in government from Harvard University. Mr. Mark Stokes, our second witness today, Executive Director of the Project 2049 Institute. Previously, he was Vice President and Taiwan Country Manager for Raytheon International, and later founder and President of Quantum Pacific Enterprises, an international consulting firm. Mr. Stokes has also served as team chief and senior country director for the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Office of Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He holds a BA from Texas A&M University and graduate degrees in International Relations and Asian Studies from Boston University and the Naval Postgraduate School. Thank you for being here. And Mr. Dean Cheng, our third witness today, Senior Research Fellow in the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, he was a senior analyst with the China Studies Division at the Center for Naval Analysis from 2001 to 2009. He specialized on Chinese military issues with a focus on Chinese military doctrine and space capabilities. He has written a number of papers and book chapters examining various aspects of Chinese security affairs, including Chinese military doctrine, the military and technological implications of the Chinese space program, and Chinese concepts of political warfare. Mr. Cheng earned a bachelor's degree in politics from Princeton University. Thank you for being here. And then our final witness today is Dr. James Lewis, Senior Vice President and Program Director for the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Prior to joining CSIS, Dr. Lewis worked at the Departments of State and Commerce as a Foreign Service Officer and as a member of the Senior Executive Service. His government experience included work on a range of political, military, and Asian security issues as a negotiator on conventional arms transfers and advanced military technology, and in developing policies for satellite exports, encryption, and the Internet. Dr. Lewis received his PhD from the University of Chicago. So I now recognize Mr. Shea for 5 minutes to present his testimony. Mr. Shea?
Well, thank you, Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Edwards, Chairman Smith, and the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify before you today. I have to note these are my own personal views and not necessarily the judgments of the U.S.-China Commission, though I draw heavily from the Commission's work. Examining China's space program has never been more crucial. Over the next 6 years, China is poised to take major steps that will draw significant attention to its efforts in space and potentially set the stage for a larger leadership role. Specifically, China plans to collect soil samples from the Moon and return them to Earth in 2017, send an unmanned spacecraft to land on the Moon's dark side before 2020, send a rover to Mars in 2020, and complete a space station in 2022. In this testimony, I want to briefly address 3 main points: the key characteristics of China's space program, the contributions it provides in economic, political, and diplomatic terms, and the implications it presents for future U.S. leadership in space. The military aspects of China's space program are covered more fully in the Commission's report of last year. China's climb to its current status as one of the world's top space powers is the result of decades of leadership attention and steady investment. It has also involved a significant effort to buy or otherwise obtain technologies from foreign sources, especially the United States. In particular, China's large-scale state-sponsored theft of intellectual property through cyber espionage has no doubt helped fill knowledge gaps in its space R&D. China's space initiatives have progressed at a much slower, more deliberate, and more methodical pace than those of the United States. For example, the United States achieved manned space flight for the first time in 1961 and the moon landing in 1969, whereas China conducted its first manned space flight in 2003 and may not plan to land on the moon until the 2030s, as revealed just this year. However, China is also pursuing multiple large-scale efforts at the same time, rather than the more sequential approach taken by the United States, making it difficult to compare the two directly. As pointed out by Chairman Smith, China does not have distinctly separate military and civilian space programs as the United States does. Rather, China's military controls the majority of the country's space assets and operations, and state-owned defense conglomerates are the key actors in the commercial space sector. Thus, even apparently civilian projects such as space exploration can directly support the development of PLA, space, counterspace, and conventional capabilities. Beijing also provides little transparency regarding its intentions in space. for example, does not release detailed budget information on its space activities. China's space program has furthered its leaders' strategic ambitions. China's advancements in space, specifically its plans for a space station, lunar exploration, and Mars exploration, provide domestic legitimacy and international prestige. China's global commercial efforts in areas such as space launch services, satellite exports, and satellite application technologies provide revenues and are expected by policymakers to spark spin-off developments in key economic sectors. Both space exploration and commercial activities open the door to China's participation in key international and bilateral initiatives, which I list in my written testimony. China has sought to work with advanced space powers where possible to improve its capabilities, most notably the European Space Agency. China has seen its greatest success in marketing commercial space services to developing countries, which are less likely to demand advanced technology subject to U.S. ITAR restrictions. China's space program has economic implications for the United States in the areas of commercial satellite and space launch services, downstream satellite navigation industries, and the potential for European countries and their industries to pursue non-U.S. technologies in order to reach the Chinese market. The full deployment of China's Beidou satellite navigation system, planned to provide global service by 2020, and the introduction of policies to promote its adoption in downstream industries may affect U.S. firms in these industries in the future. On the political side, China's activities have implications for U.S. leadership and international cooperation efforts in space. If the U.S. has a Mars program but no space station and no lunar program in the near future, while China has all three, China will be able to dictate participation in manned spaceflight as well as in scientific projects involving its space station. China has already signed agreements with the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs and the Russian and European space agencies regarding space station cooperation. Although the U.S. is prepared to maintain its leadership in the space domain, China's highly controlled, methodical, and comprehensive approach will open up opportunities for Beijing in the near term. Despite the fact that China's accomplishments and investments in space have been far outpaced by our own, it will likely appear over the next 6 years that China is reaching major milestones and gaining ground. Meanwhile, the U.S. will be focused on longer-term exploration projects, and observers will be well aware of the planned deorbiting of the International Space Station in 2024. This underscores how important it is for the U.S. to see through its long-term space exploration projects so this apparent disparity does not continue. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shea. Now recognize Mr. Stokes for 5 minutes to present his testimony. Mr. Stokes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. It's an honor and privilege to be able to have this opportunity to come and present before you today. I'd like to make 3 points. The testimony should be able to speak for itself, and I can provide more details in the question and answer session. But I'd like to make three points to sort of emphasize various aspects of developments in China's space capabilities. Number one, it's important to draw upon and augment what Mr. Shea mentioned about the difficulty between distinguishing military capabilities and civilian capabilities in China's space program. And this is part of a conscious policy referred to these days as military-civilian fusion, or MCF for short. There's a long history behind military-civilian fusion, dating back perhaps to the 1980s. Deng Xiaoping had a 16-character slogan in which military programs or military projects and civilian projects and investments were intended to support each other, with the military taking priority. The term fusion previously was referred to in English as integration, civil-military integration, now military-civilian fusion, presumably to imply a greater degree of cooperation between the two sectors. It is difficult to distinguish military and civilian programs, but one can at least make an attempt to identify an end user or a sponsor, in other words, who is actually managing a program. There are some aspects of China's space program that are managed by civilian organizations, and then there are some military end users. This was not always the case. When China embarked upon their space program in the beginning, there was very much of even more of a blurring. Over the last decade or 10, 15 years, there's been an increasing effort with the PLA developing dedicated military systems, particularly, for example, remote sensing programs. And there also, of course, are other organizations, civilian organizations that have their own systems. Say, for example, the ocean, there's an ocean organization under the State Council that's important. But part of this has to do with both spin-on and spin-off capabilities in space. The second point I'd like to make is related to technological progress that's being made, particularly in the research, development, and acquisition system. This is probably where China's made the most significant achievements, not necessarily in the technology itself, but in the ability to mobilize resources and to organize in a very progressive and reasonable fashion in terms of increasing capabilities. As mentioned in the written testimony, there's sort of a staged, phased pathway to fielding systems ranging from preliminary research or basic research to concept development to engineering research and development, then all the way up to testing and then fielding. It's important to understand where each individual program is in the cycle to get a feel for how far along that they are. There's a pretty wide body of information that outlines various programs, all the way from satellites, remote sensing satellites, communication satellites, guidance navigation satellites, significant, increasingly diverse set of launch vehicles that are being fielded, to include, starting last year, a solid fuel launch vehicle, one of their first to be deployed and operationalized. There's significant investments in the counter space systems to include the ability to track, be able to track and surveil space assets, and of course the manned space program. So the significant capabilities that are being developed in this field. There are three goals, and to put it simply, in my view, one of the key goals, of course, is political legitimacy. One has to remember that ultimately the People's Republic of China is a one-party system, and the Chinese Communist Party seeks legitimacy in various ways, in which the space program is certainly one of these. There are military goals, and again, there's a wide body of literature that outline these goals and capabilities. And then there are economic goals as well. And finally, directly addressing the issue of a space race. It's difficult to define exactly what the space race is, and it's not even clear if we're even competing or if we're going to view space as an area of competition with the People's Republic of China. And there may even be different playing fields. For example, the political playing field, I think is significant. But regardless, from a technology perspective, Beijing and authorities in Beijing are closing a technology gap. It's my view that the U.S. technologically is likely to maintain advantage, bearing in mind that I'm not necessarily an expert on U.S. space systems, given the United States makes proper investments in our space capabilities. In terms of future and goals, in terms of what the U.S. should do in order to understand this better, in terms of defining what a competition would be, there's technological aspects. There the ability to be able to apply capabilities that are being deployed, and then some comparison of the ability to mobilize resources in terms of personnel, budgets, and then organization. And with that, I will save the rest of my comments for the question and answer session.
Thank you, Mr. Stokes. Now I recognize Mr. Cheng for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Edwards, Chairman Smith, distinguished members of the committee. My name is Dean Cheng. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Chinese Political and Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation, but I'd like to emphasize that my comments today are my own. Directly to the point of whether or not there is a space race underway between the United States and China, I would like to suggest that there is not a space race per se, but rather that there is a race between the United States and China along multiple different aspects and fronts, political, diplomatic, security, all of which have a space component. And that is the Chinese perspective, because the Chinese view space as being an essential part of the larger effort to raise China's comprehensive national power. Comprehensive national power is how the Chinese basically look at various countries, including themselves, how they rank with each other, how capable they are. It includes economic, diplomatic, political, cultural, science and technology, as well as military aspects. And from the Chinese perspective, space development contributes to every one of those elements of comprehensive national power. With regards to the economy, space is seen as a pivotal technology. It is, because it is so dense, as the Chinese put it, in science and technology and high technology, because it touches on such aspects as advanced materials, telecommunications, computing, and above all, systems engineering and systems integration. The Chinese see an advancing space capability as almost like a locomotive that will pull along other parts of the Chinese economy. The space workforce, in particular, is seen as building expertise in key areas, including systems integration, and we have seen key leaders in China's space industry transfer to areas such as the Commercial Aircraft Corporation, China's effort to build their own wide-bodied aircraft, in the belief that their experience in the space sector can be translated into building Chinese challengers to Boeing and Airbus. We also see this in terms of the Chinese focus on indigenous innovation. The perception is that China's ability to field a full-blown space program will spark innovation in other areas, other key sub-technologies. In addition, of course, we also see the Chinese using space in terms of their political efforts, and this is both domestic and foreign relations. Space is a source of prestige. And prestige in this case supports both the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, but also the prestige of the People's Republic of China. For example, space achievements are often described as CCP achievements. And so China's space program, which grew out of the so-called two bombs, one satellite program, not only is a reflection of the relationship the Chinese view space with regards to key strategic weapons, but also as a means, again, of promoting innovation. We also see the expectation that economic development through space will basically, again, help spark a revival of the Chinese economy, which right now seems to be slowing down. With regards to foreign relations, again, we see space being used as a key diplomatic tool in both the bilateral and the multilateral aspects. Bilaterally, in terms of sales of satellites to such states as Venezuela, Bolivia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all of whom are key sources of raw materials that help power the Chinese economy, but also at the multilateral level, again, such as the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, which brings in Thailand, Malaysia, Mongolia. These are not major space powers per se, but they are key neighbors of the People's Republic of China, and they are using APSCO as a diplomatic tool. Of course, it is implicit that the ability to maintain space-based surveillance and to put payloads into orbit obviously affects Taiwan, obviously affects Japan. I would also suggest to the committee that when, not if, the Chinese are able to go to the moon, first with a robotic lander on the far side, to think about how you will communicate with something on the far side of the moon. In order to do that, it will require the establishment of a lunar satellite, satellites that will orbit the moon. The implications for military and security aspects are self-evident. But also, the day that the Chinese land a human being on the moon will be an enormous impact on the United States, because how often have we heard, we've gone to the moon, why haven't we solved the common cold, why haven't we solved traffic problems in downtown DC? The reality is that the day the Chinese are able to do the same thing is the day that American uniqueness will be openly challenged and Chinese prestige will be put on the same level as that of the United States. Thank you very much, members of the committee, for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cheng. Now recognize Dr. Lewis for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to testify on whether we're in a space race with China. But it's also useful to ask if we have the right strategy for space exploration in what's become a very different international environment. A comparison of the U.S. and Chinese space programs suggests that each reflects different goals rather than being a race. China's goals are political, ours are scientific. There is a degree of parallelism between the U.S. and Chinese efforts, but with the exception of human space exploration, the two programs are not really comparable. In most areas, the U.S. remains unmatched in its space capabilities. Our unmanned space exploration program has no equal in its successes. But when we talk about a space race, we're talking about human spaceflight, the area of activity where the U.S. is weakest. The classic space race between the U.S. and the Soviets centered on human spaceflight and landing on the moon. Each side tried to surpass the exploits of the other. I think it's now safe to say that the U.S. does not consider itself in a space race with China. The U.S. is focused on the manned exploration of Mars, and from a scientific perspective, going to Mars makes sense, but it doesn't make sense from a strategic perspective. China does not talk about space races, but there's an unavoidable comparison and competition with the U.S. China's focus in space exploration is on human spaceflight, and its leaders have a great interest in landing on the moon. In the U.S. and Soviet space race, the objectives were prestige and global influence. Having won the race, the U.S. largely lost interest in space. In contrast, China uses its space programs to gain political advantage. Its human space programs serve important domestic and foreign policy purposes. Human spaceflight was a central part of the Cold War contest. The assumption was that the system that won the space race was superior. The competition between the U.S. and Chinese systems is not as clear-cut, but the rest of the world thinks we're in a competition with China and that space exploration is a part of this. We should be clear that the Chinese space program largely duplicates U.S. and Soviet exploits from the 1970s and 1980s. What we do not want, however, is a tortoise and hare scenario where a slow-moving China passes the United States. American performance in space is an important element in how China will decide between confrontation or cooperation. We do not want a situation where China's leaders think, as a PLA general said last year, that the U.S. has, quote, great capability, no will, end quote. The future of space exploration requires the U.S. to make difficult choices. These choices will determine the outcome of any space race with China. A strong case can be made that the U.S. would be best served by human spaceflight programs that focused on incremental and achievable goals. We're in a very difficult international situation, and our space programs need to adjust to this. I thank the committee and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Cheng, a July article in the Wall Street Journal reported that the Director General of the European Space Agency was open to the idea of cooperating with China on board the International Space Station. China's long-term lunar plans are also consistent with Europe's lunar village concept. President Obama canceled the Constellation program that would have returned the U.S. to the moon and take astronauts on to Mars. In a speech announcing the cancellation, he argued against returning to the moon by stating, "We've been there before," rather arrogantly, I thought. The NASA administrator has stated the U.S. does not have to be the country that says, "We're going, follow us, we're all going back to the surface of the moon," but it's just that the United States has no intention of leading that effort. We will support and be along with anybody that goes. The National Academy of Sciences report, Pathways to Exploration, indicated that returning to the moon would offer significant advantages as an intermediate step to Mars. It appears as though the administration's policies are pushing our allies to cooperate with China rather than with us. Furthermore, it appears as though China may be adopting a more robust architecture for future exploration than the one proposed by this administration. What impact does that have on our nation's economic competitiveness, international standing, and national security?
Sir, to begin with, should be noted that the previous head of the European Space Agency opined that it would be very delighted to work with China on manned space literally within a week of the Chinese ASAT test in 2007, widely considered to be the single worst debris-generating event in space. So I think it is safe to say that the current head of the European Space Agency apparently is continuing a policy of basically being open to Chinese behavior, cooperating with China regardless of Chinese behavior. I would suggest that the idea that we do not need to lead in the process of going to the moon is consistent with a leading from behind philosophy that this administration has enunciated with regards to terrestrial objectives as well. But I would also emphasize here, sir, that the most important consideration is that China has been attempting to push the limits of its sovereignty into international common spaces. As I said in my spoken testimony, Chinese behavior is not about space, it is about terrestrial. But what we see in the oceans, what we see in outer space, what we see in cyberspace is China pushing its position into all of these international spaces. And if the United States does not lead, we will find ourselves operating in the Chinese framework.
Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Stokes. Mr. Shea's testimony highlights that the Chinese military and civil space programs are tightly intertwined. And some of you have already alluded to this, but I would like to hear it again. If not the same organization, they're tightly intertwined. Some argue for increased cooperation with China on civil space. Could this be done without directly benefiting Chinese military capabilities?
I would say, the short answer, it's possible, but I would recommend doing it very, very carefully.
Amen. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, current U.S. plans call for a crewed mission to Mars in the 2030s. And from what we can tell, the Chinese plan to land a crew on the moon in the same time frame. U.S. space exploration efforts have been characterized by uncertainty lately, particularly in the wake of the administration's cancellation of Constellation, and that would have returned the U.S. to the moon no later than 2020 if the administration had not raided NASA's exploration budget. Conversely, China has been fairly successful in accomplishing the goals that it sets for its space program. And Mr. Shea, in 15 years, could we find ourselves watching a Chinese astronaut land on the moon when we are years away from a U.S. Mars mission and no capability to return to the moon?
It is possible. I mean, the Chinese have earlier this year, officials within the Chinese space program have indicated that they want to land a Chinese astronaut on the moon in the 2030 timeframe. So that is possible. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, and I think we'll go to the next question. Mr. Smith? No, it's Ms. Edwards. Okay, I'm sorry. Mrs. Edwards, the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to our witnesses today. I want to start with Dr. Lewis. The National Academy's Pathways to Exploration report recommended that NASA should vigorously pursue opportunities for international and commercial collaboration in order to leverage financial resources and capabilities of other nations and commercial entities. The report goes on to say an international collaboration would be open to the inclusion of China and potentially other emerging space powers in addition to traditional international partners. Notwithstanding existing prohibitions on NASA's ability to engage in bilateral cooperation with China, do you agree with the National Academy's recommendation? And then after you answer, I'd like to turn to Mr. Shea, because in your testimony, you point to some of the public relations wins that China has achieved, making it look like the resistance to peaceful kind of cooperation and scientific cooperation is rests with the United States. And so, Dr. Lewis first.
Thank you for the question. Essentially, other countries like cooperating with the U.S. We have better technology. We spend a little more money. It's more fun to visit here. But to get that cooperation, you actually need to have programs that promise immediate and tangible results. So I don't think that saying that working with the private sector or with other countries by itself is an adequate strategy. On cooperation with China, just in the last few years, the relationship has changed to such a degree that I don't think that absent indications from China that they were more interested in serious and peaceful relationship, that cooperation would be a good idea. We can cooperate with other countries if we can show them how working with the U.S. will get them goals in space. But at the moment, with the tensions, the bilateral tensions, I don't think cooperation with China is in our interest.
Mr. Shea?
Well, your question reminded me of something completely different, but very much related, Hollywood. If you haven't noticed, the Chinese companies are buying a lot of Hollywood. One Chinese company, Wanda Dalian, owns what may be the largest or second largest theater chain, AMC, in the United States, and they are aggressively pursuing other Hollywood acquisitions. So this relates to the public perception. I think of and there's pressure within Hollywood to portray China in a benevolent manner, to portray it in a very positive manner, in order to have access to the Chinese market. And I'm thinking of two movies that are space-related, American movies, like The Martian, where the Chinese come in at the end and
Save the day.
Save the day, and the China National Space Administration is viewed as a civilian, genteel, organization. I'm also thinking of Gravity, where the movie where the Chinese space station helps Sandra Bullock get back to Earth, but also portrays the Russians as creating the largest space debris that put the Americans at risk, rather than the fact that, as alluded to, the Chinese created the largest space debris with their anti-satellite test in 2007. So this is linking Hollywood with the space program, and I think we could see more of that.
Dr. Lewis, thank you. Your report titled Space Exploration in a Changing International Environment states that the international environment for space has changed significantly. You pointed to that in your prepared testimony. Can you expand on that environment? And then the report also goes on to state that the new environment necessitates the development of a new framework for international cooperation. What would such a framework look like given the end of the operational life of the International Space Station in 2024?
Thank you. The fundamental change in the last few years we are now in a contest, and not just with China, but with other countries, including Russia, and maybe in particular Russia. And a space strategy, all of our international strategies need to recognize this. Now, a contest is not a war, it's not a new Cold War, but we're in a conflictual relationship. And I don't think that inactivity or the perception of inactivity is the right way to deal with this. The ISS is an interesting question. When it is deorbited, should it be deorbited? The U.S. could face a situation where it no longer has a presence in space. That would be really disastrous for our international reputation. So we need to think about the ISS. Some of the international partners are beginning to ask about the utility of the ISS. We really need a new project that they would be willing to fund and participate in, one where we could help lead the international community, because given our technology, our budget, our past efforts, we are the default leader if we choose to exercise it. So we need a new project to take the place of the space station, or maybe a new way to think about the space station and the moon, to energize the nations that want to work with us. But among those nations, we should be very cautious not to work with those who are our de facto opponents.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is entitled, quote, "Are we losing the space race to China?" And if I were to try to summarize your collective testimony, as I understand it, you're saying that the United States is not losing the race to China, but China is gaining ground. Mr. Shea, would that be a fair summary of your remarks?
I think that's a fair summary. I think over the next 6 years, you'll see a lot of activity by China. Moon missions, sending a rover to Mars, completing a space station, while at the same time, we won't see similar activity by the United States. We'll see the deorbiting of the ISS scheduled for 2024. So within this window of time, I think you'll see that the public perception may very well be that the Chinese are gaining ground, significant ground on the U.S. while the U.S. is standing still.
Mr. Stokes, did I accurately summarize your viewpoint?
Yes, you did, sir. I don't, I'm not sure if when you say space race, it implies a competition and it implies that we're aware of a competition. I just don't see that there's that much of an awareness, at least on the U.S. side.
Mr. Cheng, did I accurately summarize your view on this issue?
Yes, sir, I believe you did.
And Dr. Lewis, did I accurately summarize your view on this issue?
The thing I wonder about is that we have such a successful space program in other areas. Why doesn't that translate over to the manned space program? And unfortunately, when you talk about a race, you're talking about how do you keep score, and the score is determined largely by the manned program. So I think, yeah, you did summarize my views.
I come from a district in the northern part of Alabama, home of the Marshall Space Flight Center, and some would say it's the birthplace of America's manned spaceflight program. Still have about 6,000 people who are employed either by NASA at the Marshall Space Flight Center or as support contractors for NASA. So in my district, people are pretty well educated about NASA and space and why it is or is not important. That having been said, in practical day-to-day terms, why should Americans care about whether the Chinese are catching the United States of America in this space race, or perhaps even one day surpassing us? And whoever would like to handle that question, please feel free to interject. Mr. Cheng.
Sir, politics is as much about perception as it is about reality. And in this context here, the People's Republic of China has mastery of how to present itself as winning. And the issue isn't necessarily to the good folks in your district. The problem is how we are perceived in the context of an international competition, whether it is conflictual or not, and whether or not we are seen as winning. And in that regard, a China that scores what is touted by a state-run media as winning, that falls on receptive ears in Africa, in South America, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, winds up creating a situation that works against our interests.
Interesting concept. You're talking then in terms of geopolitical politics and perceptions of the different nations. Mr. Shea or Mr. Stokes or Dr. Lewis, why should the American people care that China may be gaining on us or perhaps one day surpassing us?
One of the lessons from the first space race was that space is part of being a superpower. It's part of being able to influence global politics. It's part of being able to shape how the world works. And if I had to choose, I'd rather have the U.S. shape the world than China. There is this larger narrative about that asks, is the U.S. in decline? And a lot of European outlets, every time The Economist gets a chance, they say the U.S. is in decline. They're wrong, but our inability to perform in manned space flights contributes to this narrative that the U.S. is in decline. China will be the most powerful nation in 2020 or 2030 or sometime. That's not an outcome we want.
Mr. Stokes or Mr. Shea, why should the average citizen, say, in Lexington, Massachusetts, care about whether the Chinese are gaining?
Well, I agree with what Mr. Cheng and Dr. Lewis have said in terms of the diplomatic and geopolitical implications, but also their economic implications. There's been a lot of technology and economic growth generated from a successful space program, and we need to keep those benefits here in the United States.
Mr. Stokes, do you have anything to add?
Very briefly, one of the reasons why the United States chose to compete against the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, is, at least part of the explanation is that it was viewed as part of a broader competition in terms of legitimacy. That between that of a Marxist-Leninist or the Soviet Communist Party, and then free and open societies, democracy in the United States. I would argue that the Chinese Communist Party should be viewed in a similar light, and that's just in terms of legitimacy, and that's just one of many, many reasons, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all so much for coming. Mr. Shea, it's in your written and oral testimony talked about, let me quote, Beijing has heavily emphasized both commercial launch services and satellites exports as its space industry has developed. And both activities provide China's space industry with revenues, opportunities to measure the quality of its products and services against international competitors, and in industrial development synergies, et cetera. One of the things this committee has done in a very bipartisan way is tried to be champions for the development of the commercial space industry here in the United States. Does China represent a real threat to our commercial space industry? Or is the competition good for our commercial space industry?
It doesn't represent a threat, not at the high end, but there is, one of our recommendations last year was to look at the ITAR regulations to see whether they're overly restrictive and China would have access to technologies that are otherwise restricted by ITAR through non-U.S. sources. So that's one thing we recommended last year. But China's satellite launch services and satellite business is really, for now at least, directed at developing countries that don't necessarily need the best technology, but need a cheaper solution. So right now, that's where the Chinese are focusing their efforts. But they want to compete. When we went to Beijing last year, we met with the Great Wall Industry Corporation, which it's state-led, performs their satellite launch services for international customers, and they're very negative about the ITAR restrictions, not surprisingly, but they want to have greater access to the market.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Lewis, again, this committee has been tried to really be a champion for open data, often reflected in different political things, whether it's the data that the EPA uses to proclaim its rules, or our support for all the scientists that the U.S. government funds, making their data available to other scientists. Do you see any of the possibility for open data coming from the Chinese investments in space? What will we learn from their new telescope, for example, compared to what we'll be able to make available to the world from James Webb or from Hubble?
The Chinese, in some ways, are still ambivalent about how to deal with the U.S., and there's a strong nationalist sentiment that calls for confrontation, but there's also a recognition of the benefits of cooperation and the strength of the United States, not somebody you might want to pick a fight with. So we have opportunities to, maybe niche opportunities, I don't know what my other panelists would say, to cooperate with them. Their scientists are like our scientists, but their scientists are not always in charge. So the Chinese will look for cooperation, Chinese scientists will look for cooperation, and perhaps their government will let them do it to some extent.
Is the merging of their version of NASA with their version of the Department of Defense the real bar for us? That they don't have an independent space agency that's not militaristic?
No, I don't think so, Congressman. I think that it's the larger Chinese policies of pushing back on the U.S., of challenging us in as many areas as possible. So even if it was a purely civilian space agency, they would still be answering to President Xi and the party.
We had the author of The Martian here a few months ago, and as you will recall from the book and the movie, they turned to China to help when the guy was stranded on Mars. Is that just a space fantasy?
I wouldn't use the book as a guideline for space policy. Although I loved the movie, great movie, but not.
Mr. Stokes, we've heard a number of times that China really lags. That they are 40 years behind us in terms of getting people into space. But their quantum experiments at the QESS satellite seem to be an exception. That they may be able to beam quantum encrypted information between orbiting satellites and ground stations. A revolutionary technology. Does this give them a specific advantage over us? Are they experimenting in places that we're ignoring?
So when you mention quantum satellites, I mean, it goes way over my head.
Oh, okay.
But in general, my understanding is that the end user, or the sponsoring organization, is based in Shanghai, under the China Academy of Sciences, ostensibly civilian. It's experimental in nature. I think it's safe to assume that it has military applications as well, related to encryption and other aspects of military capabilities. But it's something we should watch very carefully. So I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Byer. Now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our panelists. I'm glad to see there's so much agreement on our panel today. There's been a lot of talk about the space race. I want to be clear, we put men on the moon. We've got 2 rovers currently operating on the surface of Mars. We have explored the furthest reaches of the solar system. The space race is over and we won. The question is now, how are we utilizing space and how are our near-peer competitors utilizing space? And the question is, are we ceding leadership to the Chinese? China is building a new space station, as has already been identified. It has a moon rover, recently launched the world's quantum communication satellite, as we just talked about, which does have very specific military implications, and it's expanding its Beidou PNT system. Take into account that there is no distinction between China's peaceful and military space programs, and these developments become very alarming quickly. Given their notorious lack of transparency, we do not know their true intentions with a space station, nor do we even know what they are currently doing on the moon. Quantum technology is virtually unhackable and would give the Chinese a distinct advantage over any current military communications that we have as a nation. Utilizing Beidou gives the Chinese an outlet for PNT that is separate from our own GPS. As they're developing their own GPS-type constellation, they are also developing and undertaking direct descent anti-satellite missile capabilities, such as the 2007 direct descent test that destroyed a LEO satellite. They're advancing spoofing and dazzling technologies and carrying out pernicious state-sponsored cyber espionage, including a hack of the National Weather Service, which compelled us to shut down ground stations for 2 days in this country, deteriorating forecasts and putting my constituents in danger. And that threatened also the safety of millions of Americans, including the constituents of everybody on this panel. It is clear that China views space as the ultimate high ground, and they are rapidly making moves to establish themselves in a position of strength, while also improving their ability to deny us the use of space. Given the threat from China, we cannot afford to have the DoD doing extraneous activities not within its mission. As a point of departure, we must give the responsibility for providing space situational awareness for commercial and foreign entities to a civil agency, namely FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation. The Department of Transportation and the DoD concurred and endorsed this proposal in a recent report ordered by Section 110 of the Commercial Space Bill, recently enacted in 2015. I urge all of my colleagues to read the Section 110 report. Next, we have a chance to pass a NASA authorization this year. That bill should direct NASA to utilize the moon on our journey to Mars. Mr. Chairman, I think that's a great idea that you said, and I think we need to go forward with that. Our allies want to go there, as does a wide swath of our domestic commercial space industry. If we do not, our allies will work with China. They're either going to come into our orbit or they're going to go into their orbit, no pun intended. Further, the bill should include the formation of a plan for a post-ISS world. We cannot afford a gap in LEO platforms similar to our gap in human transportation that currently exists. Including these policies will go a long way toward ensuring that we do not leave a power and leadership vacuum for China to fill. Unfortunately, NASA, under this administration, seems more focused on forcing partnership with China than in maintaining our leadership. Former Chairman Frank Wolf was a leader on this, and our country is grateful for his work. he first codified restrictions on cooperation with China in space. On top of their belligerent space activity, China is run by a brutal regime that imprisons dissidents and persecutes minorities. State-sponsored cybercrimes have robbed our companies of billions of dollars of intellectual property, doing untold damage to our economy. When does it stop, is the question. Mr. Chairman, any NASA bill should permanently codify the restrictions on cooperation with China while also discouraging others from partnering with the Chinese. We must treat China's actions in space for the threat that they are and ensure that we stay ahead of them technologically while preventing any vacuums in leadership that they might exploit. Mr. Cheng, my question is for you. Given that China considers space security equivalent to maritime security, as you've kind of already talked about, is it reasonable to expect that China will behave in space similar to how it has behaved in the South China Sea?
Representative, obviously it's going to be a little bit difficult to build artificial islands in space, but I think that what we should expect to see is the Chinese attempting to redefine the international rules to new sets that will basically benefit the Chinese. There have been comments about, for example, the requirement that foreign aircraft and ships should turn off their radars when operating in China's claimed waters. It would not be surprising if there was a comparable effort to basically say to operators of space-based surveillance systems, you turn them on over China at your own risk.
I'm out of time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Now I recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much. I'd like each member to comment on this. What are the implications that China might match or surpass the U.S. civilian space capabilities in the near future or the distant future? And if they do, what are the key areas? What are the implications of that possibility? And also comment the risk and benefits associated with NASA collaborating with China in space activities. So let me start with Mr. Shea, but I'd like each panel member to comment on that.
Well, I'll answer, Mrs. Congresswoman, your second question first. I agree that we need to be very skeptical with cooperative efforts with China. It has been well documented they've engaged in a large-scale cyber and other types of espionage directed at the United States. Their space program is predominantly a military program. They, as we've outlined in our report, they're heavily engaged in counter space activities such as anti-satellite, kinetic anti-satellite missiles, co-orbital anti-satellite systems like robotic arms that could grab satellites. They know that the United States is heavily dependent on space for its projection of military power. So they are engaged in a very robust counter space program to deter us from taking action or to attack our satellites if in the eventuality of a conflict. I think it would be, your first question, the broader answer, I think it would be an absolute shame. I don't see it happening, but I think it would be an absolute shame if the United States somehow were behind China technologically because of all the political implications in space, because of the political implications of that, because of the economic implications of that for our own country. So I don't see it happening. As I said in my testimony, I think over the next 6 years, people might perceive the Chinese as gaining significant ground, and which just reinforces the need for the United States to keep its eye on the ball and to have a very strong and robust space program.
Thank you.
If I can make two quick points. First of all, as previously discussed, I wouldn't automatically rule out cooperation in certain aspects of space. I would advocate looking at our relationship with the People's Republic of China from a much broader perspective in terms of a competitive sense. That is a competition in values and universal values in a competition in principles. From that perspective, there may be areas of cooperation, and if there are areas of cooperation, they should be done from the perspective of how it creates leverage for the United States in terms of our fundamental interests and our fundamental values. That's the first point. The second point is there are other areas in which I don't sense that we are really competing, and China is making heavy investments. It's in an area, not sure how one would describe it, but near space. That's that domain between, let's say, 20 kilometers in altitude and perhaps 100 kilometers in altitude. Normally, it's an area to get through, for example, in terms of returning through the atmosphere to get back to Earth. But this is an area where they're making significant investments, including the establishment of dedicated research institutes within the defense industry, both in terms of precision strike, long-range precision strike weapon systems, as well as a reconnaissance system that are able to linger in that particular domain.
One of the great areas of American strength is our private sector. And we are seeing with folks like SpaceX and Blue Horizon a interesting revival of the private sector's interest in space. Where they are likely to go in terms of innovation, I suspect, is something the Chinese are desperately afraid of, because they understand that companies are more flexible and can often be driven harder because of the vision of their directors. At the same time, as a result, one suspects that the Chinese are likely to therefore try and, quote-unquote, partner with our private sector, or simply buy, controlling interests in stock and the like. In that regard, I think that one of the areas that we need to be wary of is, quote-unquote, collaboration between Chinese state-owned enterprises and our private sector.
Thank you for the question. Just to maybe put this a little bit in perspective, the real issue here is who lands first. And I don't care if it's on the moon or on Mars, but when you see that picture, do you want the picture of the astronaut holding the flag to be holding an American flag or a Chinese flag? We all remember the picture from the Apollo program. So really, if we could land on Mars before China can go to the moon, great, let's do it. But I don't feel confident in saying that. Who lands first? On cooperation with the Chinese, and this might be the first question where the panel sort of disagrees a little bit, so I'm glad we finally got there. They're hostile, but they're also pragmatic, right? They can be engaged. You can come to arrangements with them. I think the agreement on commercial cyber espionage is a good example of that. They are pragmatic in a way that the Russians are not. But we need engagement and agreement on the rules for how we will operate in space before we can cooperate. I mean, the Chinese will test us, and right now, if we don't push back, cooperation is not in our interest. It's a complicated relationship, but it's one where we have many of the advantages, particularly in technology. And in most of the areas of space, we just do better. So the question is, how do we take advantage of our leadership? How do we come up with a strategy to lead, not only with the rest of the world, but with China?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Competition is part of life. I think that America has led in this endeavor for many, many years. But there's so much that is going on right now, and with the technological advances that are happening today, there are so many things that we can do. Back in the early 60s, we were trying to go to the moon because I do believe it was part of the competition. We also had many programs that were going on in the early 60s, like maybe the X-20 Dinosaur program that would have been the first space shuttle. And we decided not to do that. We decided to go to the moon, and which is the goal that everyone looks to today. But the point is we always have an awful lot of things that are happening. And I think the Chinese are now discovering that maybe if they put their goals on some finite situations, they might be able to beat us at certain things. So we broke the sound barrier first. We were on the moon first. We did all of these things first. And they might be able to do some of these finite goals, and we might be looking at 100 different goals. So is that what we're kind of looking at today, that competitively, look, we want to be on Mars first. We want to do this first. Or are we looking at the expanse of space exploration and achieving some of these goals for a much bigger product, a much bigger program.
Well, I think that's a fair point, Congressman. I think the Chinese, it's my understanding that if they fulfill their goal of landing an unmanned spacecraft on the moon's dark side before 2020, they'll be the first country to have done that. So you're right, that they may be seeking smaller niche goals, maybe not the big picture goals, but to promote their own prestige with the domestic audience, seeking goals that have maybe not as powerful, but goals nonetheless.
And I'll jump in just real quick. I want to thank the chairman for talking about one of the programs that's in my district, the SOFIA program, that is an American-German kind of connection there, that we have a telescope that goes into space and goes above the water vapors, and we can do that type of exploration on a daily basis and change the technology on a daily basis. Is that something that we should be better at, and having better connections with other countries that can help us, not just with money, but with technology, with all of the things that we're looking at to advance, and maybe advancing with a connection to other countries and saying this is what we're trying to get to. And Mr. Cheng, go ahead.
Representative, leadership is a matter of not simply saying we are going to head in a particular direction, but being able to persuade others to join us. And as my fellow panelists have also pointed out, other nations do want to join us. It does entail, however, having a vision, having an objective, having a target, and having the persistence, which is the one great advantage the Chinese have. Their manned space program dates back at least to the late 1980s, and it has enjoyed consistent top-level support through multiple changes of leadership. Whether or not we have that persistence is something the Chinese are looking at, but also our allies. And so I would hope that the SOFIA program and other programs will be the start, not the end, of that kind of cooperation. Let me also just note very quickly that we are the main explorer of the outer solar system. We have sent more, I believe, probes out beyond Mars than any other nation, or even a group of nations combined. And that, too, is an area that could be one of leadership and in encouraging cooperation with our friends and allies.
Maybe to follow up quickly, thank you for the question. I think the real issue is, what do we want to do about exploration beyond low Earth orbit? In low Earth orbit, we know how to do it. It's great, but it's why do we get out of LEO, right? And what's the best way to do that? And there's some issues that I think fall under the purview of this committee, but also the larger discussion. Do we focus on manned missions, or do we focus on robotic? We've had tremendous success in robotic. Do we go for Mars, or do we go for the moon? I tend to like the moon because I know we can get there. Mars, it's kind of a long shot, but it's a legitimate question. And finally, we need to rethink the outlines of cooperation, both with our European partners, with the other spacefaring partners, but maybe also with China. And in that sense, to your original point, I think having a clear goal helps. Having a lot of efforts may not be the best way to achieve cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Yes, sir. Now call on the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And gentlemen, thank you for your testimony today. I really do appreciate the panelists all almost nodding as each of you is speaking, because you all seem to be pretty much on the same page. And I think for the members up here, a very similar kind of view of this. And so I appreciate your testimony. I'm not often on the same page as the Heritage Foundation. I can tell you that, Mr. Cheng. Mr. Bridenstine, and so we agree, this panel, on a lot of the space exploration components and this potential for a space race that we're not winning. We've been able to win in the past. And Mr. Bridenstine is pretty single-minded in talking about commercial space and the ability to expand that and the potential innovation that our private sector brings to, exploring at least low Earth orbit, if not farther. And there's a thing I'm pretty single-minded about, and Mr. Knight will start laughing at me, but 2033, okay? So we've had testimony by NASA engineers and other experts that 2033 orbits of Mars and Earth are in pretty good alignment to save a lot of space travel time, and that 17 years helps us put the building blocks in place to get to Mars, get our astronauts to Mars. So human spaceflight, Dr. Lewis, which is what you've been talking about. And one of those building blocks certainly could be going back to the moon. Now, I'm not the engineer, I'm not the scientist. I don't know the best way to do it. But I do know, as a member of Congress, we need to have long-term mission that we, as members of Congress, stand behind from administration to administration. So, Mr. Cheng, to your point, we've seen different administrations change how we looked at our space program. So I think we do have a potential for a mission that is long-term in nature, that will continue to add to our expertise and our leadership in space. All right, here's my question. We've had testimony by prior panels that one of the last places where we've had some decent diplomatic dialogue between ourselves and the Russians has been with respect to our scientists and our space programs. Continue to use their rockets to help us get to the space station. Is there the potential for us to have that kind of dialogue with the Chinese scientists? Is it, you've all used words like wary and skeptical. You've used cooperation and competition, hostile and pragmatic. Is there a way for us to work with their scientists to really start broadening cooperation, if you will? And I'll open it to anybody on the panel if you feel like answering it.
If I can just draw one thread that you put out. You mentioned about the U.S. using Russian launch vehicles for some of our satellites and space programs. Of course, I think it's well known that we formally did both sell satellites to the People's Republic of China and also license some of our companies to be able to use Chinese launch vehicles in terms of delivering payloads into space. That was restricted in let's call it 1996, if I'm not mistaken. It continues to be restricted until today. I mean, this is something that every once in a while it's raised again in terms of allowing the licensing of U.S. satellites, in terms of sales of satellites, and also allowing U.S. companies to contract with launch vehicle providers. The main restriction is that requires, if I'm not mistaken, a munitions license, and there are restrictions under the 1989 Tiananmen sanctions that exist until today, and perhaps for good reason. But that's certainly something that could be looked at. Again, I suppose it's not just cooperation, but it's actually licensing and a technical issue.
Okay. Well, in our report, I think in my testimony as well, we outlined the wolf restriction doesn't prohibit all sorts of interactions between Chinese scientists and U.S. scientists. So there are some interactions that are not covered by the wolf law. We do cooperate on collision avoidance. My colleagues correct me. There's debris. U.S. space operators inform their counterparts in China when debris is getting near a Chinese satellite or other. So we do cooperate in that sense. You raised the Russians. I mean, one thing I would be looking at is increased China-Russia cooperation. We see that here on planet Earth. China and Russia engaged in joint naval exercises in the South China Sea recently. So I could see China-Russia cooperation on joint rocket engine development, maybe Russian participation in the Chinese Tiangong-2 Chinese space station going forward. So I'd keep an eye on that as well.
Okay, thank you. And I just think there's this yin and the yang going on between competition and cooperation. To the degree the competitive juices of America start flowing, I think that's to the benefit of all of us, but also cooperation just to keep peace in our time doesn't hurt us. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Now I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cheng, in your comments you mentioned a Chinese program called One Satellite, Two Bombs. What does that mean and what does it stem from?
In the 1960s, China, under Mao Zedong, basically said that in order to be a competitive major power, China, first off, needed to develop nuclear weapons. And in fact, there's all sorts of rather breathtaking language by Mao about how the Chinese people will eat grass if necessary. But what that led to was in 1964, on its own, without external assistance, China exploded its first atomic bomb. In 1967, it exploded its first hydrogen or fusion bomb. And in 1970, it launched its first satellite, the Dongfeng Hong-1. 2 bombs, 1 satellite. It is now embodied in Chinese terminology as evidence of 2 things. 1, how far China is prepared to go in order to achieve strategic objectives, and 2, the self-reliance. Now, self-reliance doesn't mean that you don't do cyber espionage and other things, but it does mean that at the end of the day, China sets goals and it will achieve them.
Thanks for that. One of the ways that the United States collaborated with China with commercial technology, pseudo-commercial technology, was to help them launch multiple low Earth orbit satellites off of one launch vehicle. Is anyone familiar with this program where in the early 90s, almost immediately after removing Release of Sensitive Technology Authority from defense and giving it to commerce, we helped China develop this technology? Was that good collaboration?
If I can take a first hack at it, that was a Motorola program, if I'm not mistaken.
It's L'Oreal, I think, right?
Iridium, I think. Something.
The Iridium, yeah, the Iridium program. In particular, I believe it was certifying their what's called smart dispenser that has direct application, of course, to a MIRV capability. And if you look at the sort of the timelines, looking at research and development timelines that match up, it's kind of hard to not conclude that there was a connection.
It's difficult to answer this question in an unclassified setting, but it was not purely advantage to China.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, could I yield 30 seconds to my colleague, Mr. Bridenstine?
I just wanted to.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to directly respond to something that my good friend, Mr. Perlmutter from Colorado, said, which was the cooperation with the Russians and using their launch capabilities for our civil space programs. It was an article in Aviation Week and Space Technology, probably about 7 months ago. I read the defense minister for Russia stated very clearly, they were asking, how are you financing your military communications, space-based communications programs? How are you financing your military remote sensing and imagery capabilities? And he said very clearly in the article that they're financing it with off-balance sheet financing from expenditures from launching foreign satellites and astronauts. So when we cooperate in that way, we have to be really clear about what we're doing. We are financing the defense and military capabilities of the Russians. And I just wanted to get that on the record.
Thank you. And I want to tie that together in terms of collaboration. Sometimes, perhaps some ways that have benefited us, some ways that have not been beneficial to us. Clearly, the whole panel has talked a lot about soft power. And I'm curious, where is China particularly successful with existing space powers like Russia, like European countries, but also with non-space powers? So how has China been successful with the use of soft power in their space program?
Well, China is using space, I think Mr. Cheng mentioned this earlier, China's using space as part of a broader relationship with countries, less developed countries. With Pakistan, it's provides space assistance, but it's tied into this China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is on the ground. China is building out something called the One Belt, One Road initiative, and it's intends to provide BEIDO coverage to most One Belt, One Road countries by 2018. So space is a component of a broader foreign policy, diplomatic outreach to less developed countries.
Thank you, and I apologize because I have very little time, but I was glad you connected the One Belt, One Road, and Mr. Cheng in particular referenced China's ability to stay on a unified, coherent national strategy. And I would argue that since the end of the Cold War, they have been the single nation that has done that with success. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Davidson. You sure can. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'd like to just say to my friend from Oklahoma, I agree. I wasn't talking about the fact we're paying for these launch vehicles, but to have a back channel for diplomatic purposes sometimes is very important if the political systems between the two countries aren't working. So scientists sometimes lend us that back channel. That's really what I intended to convey. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. This concludes this hearing. It's been very informative, very educational. I want to thank the witnesses profusely for their valuable testimony and the members for your questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from the members. So this hearing is adjourned.